Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Barbarians at the Gate by Bryan Burrough and John Helyar. I'll talk briefly about the authors, go into an overview of what the book is, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and finish off with who I'd recommend the book to and what I will be reading for next time. Fortunately, I don't have a cover to share. I read this on ebook. Bryan Burrough and John Helyar wrote this book back in the late 80s. I think it's either 88 or 89 when this came out. They were both relatively young and reporters for the Wall Street Journal. They teamed up to write this book, which has been fairly well established as one of the classics of the nonfiction business book genre. And they're still kind of their best known for this work. They've never worked together or anything since then, but have both gone on to kind of their own solo careers with both long-form journal writing as well as writing nonfiction work. Nonfiction novels. They for this book they interviewed over 100 people, and what the book covers about a 6-month period in the history of R.J. Nabisco and its CEO at the time, Ross Johnson, in order to both kind of make himself quite a bit of money and to drive up the stock price of the company, decides to enlist a banking consortium to put up a bid to purchase the company in what is known as a leveraged buyout. I'm not really financially savvy enough to describe in detail what that is, but my understanding is using the underlying asset of the good that you're purchasing in order to establish junk bonds, sell those bonds to raise money. So it's basically trying to raise monies without having cash on hand. But the book basically follows his attempt at buying the company out with another group. He's the CEO. He has the management on his side. He enlists a company called, I think they're called Shearson, and they're a bunch of bankers and lawyers, and they're basically competing with two other groups. One of them is called First Bank, and the other one is Kravis. I think it's called KKR, is the company that he is a founder of. And the book is really basically the inside the trenches looks at what happens once this kind of plan goes into motion. So a lot of it is, how do you go about establishing the value of a company? How do you go about establishing strategy as to how you will put forward a winning bid so that the board of directors selects you to go forward in your plan? So the book is really interesting from that standpoint. There's a lot of twists and turns. It's a huge cast of characters. In a lot of ways, it's basically like a 20 to 30 page case study stretched over to 600 pages, and that may be really boring for some people, but I found the book really interesting because I think it touches on a lot of interesting points in business in terms of potential conflict of interest between board members and the management, in terms of shareholders who may be employees and the management, in terms of bankers and lawyers and the management in this kind of leveraged buyout, because they each all have kind of conflicting interests or their interests don't completely align. Talks a little bit about to what degree a CEO really should be able to benefit off perks. Ross Johnson kind of famously throughout the book has kind of a huge fleet of aircrafts. I think at one point there's 7 or 8 different aircrafts, and he kind of doles out the privilege of using these aircrafts to people that some people may see as bribes. It goes into a little bit of the history of all these companies. It touches on the Premier cigarette, which was a cigarette that R.J. Reynolds was kind of developing at the time. And it basically talks about how it was ultimately a failure. It doesn't talk about it in this book as much, but in some ways a predecessor to something like a vaping pen, and how that product at the time just kind of fell on its face completely. It kind of goes back and forth and kind of explains how all the teams kind of how they kind of gather information, what sources they can use to gather information. So all that stuff, if any of that's interesting to you, I would definitely check it out. Like I said, to my understanding, it's kind of well known as being a classic of the genre. So if you want something that's kind of like really well reported basically putting you inside the deliberation process of how a board of directors decides to accept a bid for their company. This is pretty much as good as you're going to get. It also, the authors had really strong access to almost all the players, which I don't think I've ever seen before. And the authors are also really good at pointing out where there's conflicts of the narrative. So maybe two people who were in a room had different viewpoints of why something happened. I think they go to pains to kind of point out where that is. So I think that was all really, really well done. I think if I have any qualms with the book is relatively long. I mean, it's 600 pages. And even though I found myself really interested in what would happen, I did feel like there are times where there are certain parts that maybe could have been cut. It wouldn't be a ton. There wasn't a ton of stuff they could cut. But there's a little bit of like the personal lives of some of these people where I think that they maybe could have excised some of these parts to make it a little bit shorter. And as like any other book that was written in kind of the late 80s, there's some turns of phrases that I think are kind of dated terms. I don't think there's anything in here that's like really offensive would be offensive to anybody, but there are some things where they're just terms and phrases that are not kind of used in everyday vernacular that I had to kind of scratch my head and kind of wonder what exactly they were talking about. But overall, I really, really enjoyed it. I would recommend this to anybody who liked the show Succession. So if you're interested in reading kind of like a long form work of nonfiction about business, this to me would be something that's really right up a lot of people's alleys. I think the other book that it really reminded me of, and I liked that book a little bit more, but this I put on kind of a similar level. There's a book called Disney War by James Stewart, which is kind of a similar look at the relationship between Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg towards the end of their partnership with Disney. I like that book a little bit more. It feels a little bit more... It feels less tied to a timeline of events and more about kind of the personalities. So I really enjoyed that book. But if you liked either one of those, I would definitely check this out. So that is Barbarians at the Gate by Bryan Burrough and James, I believe it's James Helyar. Next time I'm going to be reading a book called No Shame in My Game. And until next time, please feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitter. Until next time, bye.